He is remembered as a monster, a tyrant, a madman, a name that almost became another word for fear, Ivan the Terrible. But if that label is all you know, you are only seeing the final and darkest layer of the story. The real Ivan IV was not only one of the most brutal rulers in Russian history. He was also a frightened child, a reformer, a state builder, and eventually something very close to what he feared most. That does not mean he was innocent, and it does not mean violence can be explained away as inevitable. His reign contained real terror, real killing, and real institutional change. The question is not whether Ivan was cruel. The question is why history left us with the simplest word, monster. And the more difficult question is what a child has to survive before fear becomes the only language that feels safe. Ivan was born into Muscovy, a world that was not yet the modern Russian state. His dynasty was trying to pull scattered lands, noble families, and older power traditions into a more centralized rule. His father, Vasily III, died when Ivan was still a small child. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, ruled as regent for a short time, but she also died while Ivan was young. Later stories claim she may have been poisoned, though that remains a debated part of the historical record. For the young Ivan, the most certain fact was not the conspiracy itself, but the sudden loss of protection. On paper, he was the ruler. In reality, he was surrounded by powerful boyar families. These noble houses fought for influence, humiliated one another, and showed the young Ivan the ugliest side of court politics. Later accounts describe Ivan as neglected, insulted, and exposed to violence inside the palace. Not every detail can be verified with certainty, but they all point toward the same atmosphere: insecurity. He sat at the center of power without truly controlling power. What he learned early was not trust. It was the expectation of betrayal. This is the beginning of Ivan's story that is easiest to ignore. Later generations saw the Tsar with the blade, not the frightened child waiting to be swallowed by his own court. In 1547, Ivan was crowned as Tsar, a title with enormous meaning. He was no longer only the Grand Prince of Moscow. He was presenting himself as a sacred ruler. The word Tsar carried echoes of Caesar Empire and the Orthodox Christian world. For Ivan, this was not just a title, it was a mission. He wanted to rule not merely a coalition of nobles, but a Russian state that was still taking shape. The young Ivan was not simply a tyrant who knew only fear. Around him emerged a group of advisors often remembered as a reforming circle. During this period, he pushed changes in law, administration, military organization, and church affairs. The Law Code of 1550 tried to bring more order to justice and local government. Local administration also shifted, allowing central authority to reach deeper into the provinces. In the military, new forces such as the Streltsy strengthened the armed power directly available to the Tsar. These were not democratic reforms in the modern sense. They were tools of centralization, but they do show that young Ivan was not only chaos and destruction. He had a clear ambition to build the state and push the nobility beneath royal authority. For many viewers, this is the first twist. The man remembered as terrible was, in his youth, also a reformer. But in Ivan's world, reform and violence were not opposites. The more he tried to build a stronger state, the more he feared old noble power might tear it away from him. That fear soon found an outlet in war. In 1552, Ivan captured the Khanate of Kazan, one of the great victories of his early reign. The fall of Kazan expanded Muscovy's power and strengthened Ivan's image as a conqueror. Astrakhan later came under Muscovite control as well. These victories made Ivan appear like a ruler favored by heaven. He was not merely defending his state, he was expanding it. But victory can create a dangerous illusion. When a young ruler succeeds in war, it becomes easier to believe his will is the direction of history. At this point, Ivan had not yet fully become the symbol of terror. But behind the glory, another Ivan was slowly forming. His private life changed dramatically as well. His first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, held an important place in his life. Many traditional accounts describe her as a stabilizing influence on his temper and judgment. In 1560, Anastasia died, and her death became a severe turning point in Ivan's life. Ivan suspected that she had been poisoned by nobles, though that accusation cannot be treated as a simple certainty. What matters is that he believed it was possible, and the suspicion began to consume him. After that, Ivan's fear of the nobility grew deeper. He no longer suspected only that they wanted influence. He suspected they wanted to destroy his family and his state. Here, private grief and political mistrust fused together. A ruler is often most dangerous not when he lacks power, but when he has power and believes himself surrounded. At the same time, the Livonian War dragged Ivan into a long and exhausting struggle. He wanted access to the Baltic, seeking trade routes and strategic openings to the west. But this war was far more complicated than the earlier conquest of Kazan. Muscovy now faced powerful rivals including Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden. The war dragged on, draining resources and creating pressure through repeated disappointment. As victory moved further away, Ivan's suspicion became more intense. Failure demands an explanation, and autocrats often find the easiest explanation in betrayal. So Ivan began to see state problems as loyalty problems. Anyone who opposed him, hesitated, failed, or merely stood in the wrong place could enter the same dangerous category. This was the road toward the Oprichnina. In 1565, Ivan created the Oprichnina, one of the most infamous systems of his reign. He divided the realm into separate spheres, one under his direct control and another left to older administrative structures. The Oprichniki became his personal instrument of terror. They moved through lands, towns, and noble estates, hunting, confiscating, punishing, and spreading fear. Their later image became highly symbolic: black clothing, horses, brooms, and dogs' heads to sniff out and sweep away treason. Some details carry a literary afterlife, but the terror function itself was real. Ivan claimed he was removing treason and defending sacred rule. In reality, the Oprichnina destroyed many noble families and damaged the social order. Fear was no longer just a side effect of government. Fear became the government. This is the part of Ivan that is hardest to defend. His childhood fear helps explain why he distrusted the boyars. But explanation is not acquittal. Once he held the power to execute, exile, and confiscate, he chose to expand fear into an institution. History can understand how trauma becomes politics, but it cannot turn political violence into decoration. One of the most horrifying events of the Oprichnina was the punishment of Novgorod in 1570. Ivan suspected the city of plotting with Lithuania. He arrived with armed forces and oprichniki, and a campaign of severe repression followed. The exact number of deaths remains disputed, with different sources giving very different figures. But there is no serious dispute that the city suffered a devastating catastrophe. Novgorod became one of the darkest symbols of Ivan's rule by terror. Here the label Monster Tsar did not come from nothing. It came from real blood, real fear, and real destruction. But the problem with a label is that it lets the audience stop thinking. Once we say he was just a monster, we stop asking how institutions, war, noble conflict, and sacred authority shaped him. Ivan was not an evil man who appeared from nowhere. He was a product of a violent age, and also a man who made that age more violent. Both truths have to stand at the same time. If we call him only a victim, we erase his crimes. If we call him only a monster, we erase the world that produced the monster. Ivan's religious imagination deepened this contradiction. He saw himself as a ruler, authorized by God, and often explained his power through religious language. In his world, political betrayal was not only a crime, it was close to a spiritual evil. That gave punishment a sacred costume. When a ruler believes he is cleaning treason on behalf of God, cruelty becomes harder to limit. But Ivan was not simply an uncontrolled madman. At times, he was calculating, literate, politically sharp, and capable of complex strategy. That makes him more frightening than the label mad tyrant suggests. His terror was not always chaotic eruption. Sometimes it was a designed political tool. Later generations often rendered his name in English as Ivan the Terrible. But the Russian word Grozny is more complicated than the English word terrible. It can suggest something fearsome, formidable, awe-inspiring, and severe. This does not mean translation alone created his dark reputation. It means language helped compress his image into one simple symbol of horror. A complex word entered the English-speaking world and became an easy judgment. So the reformer, conqueror, wounded child, religious monarch, and architect of terror were pushed into one word: terrible. The word has power, but it also has danger. It makes people remember, but it also makes people lazy. Ivan's later life became even more shadowed. In 1581, a fatal conflict occurred between Ivan and his son, also named Ivan. Later tradition says the Tsar struck and killed his own heir, though the details remain debated by historians. Repin's famous painting turned that moment into one of the most haunting father-son tragedies in Russian memory. Whatever the exact details, the story survived because it fit what people already feared about Ivan. A man who ruled the state through fear could not even keep fear out of his own family. This is the danger of historical labels. They choose the image that proves them best, then allow that image to stand for an entire life. After Ivan died, Russia did not enter a peaceful golden age. His succession problems, war exhaustion, social wounds, and political structures left deep consequences. Decades later, Russia fell into the time of troubles, though it would be too simple to blame everything on Ivan alone. Still, his reign clearly deepened many of the cracks that later widened, so we cannot turn him into a misunderstood hero. That would be even less honest than the old label. The more accurate answer is this: Ivan was simplified, not falsely accused. He did reform, and he did terrorize. He built the state, and he wounded the state. He feared betrayal, and he forced countless people to live between betrayal and silence. He was not a fairy tale monster, but something more disturbing from history. A person with intelligence, trauma, belief, political goals, and still a repeated choice for cruelty. That is harder to face than a simple monster, because it reminds us that terror does not always come from meaningless madness. Sometimes it comes from the language of order, loyalty, national security, and one man's fear. That is the truly frightening part of Ivan the Terrible's story. He was not dangerous because he had no humanity. He was dangerous because he turned human fear into a machine of state. When history calls him the monster Tsar, it is not completely lying. But it is not telling the whole truth either. In the full story, there is an orphaned child and a young ruler desperate for order. There is a conqueror, a reformer, a devout and brutal monarch. There is also a man who turned suspicion into policy, grief into punishment, and power into fear. So the question is not simply, was Ivan the Terrible really a monster? The better question is when a person begins to believe that only a monster can survive. And once he finally gains power, how many others must pay the price for that belief? That is the shadow Ivan IV left behind. Not a simple villain, and not a misunderstood saint. A ruler frozen by history inside the language of fear. He tried to build a stronger state. But he also taught that state that power could speak through terror. In the end, his name did not preserve only reform, and it did not preserve only conquest. It preserved a question. When fear becomes a method of rule, does the state grow stronger, or does it only learn to be afraid? That is why centuries later, Ivan the Terrible has still never fully escaped the label.